Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Dear listeners, this is the first podcast episode I'm recording after top surgery. Very exciting. Right now, I'm still recovering, therefore, no resistance training for at least another 4 weeks. But other than that, I am doing really well. I am very content and at peace with my body, and I cannot wait to get into this solo episode, in which I want to talk about strategies to avoid losing muscle in a calorie deficit. But first of all, how likely is it that you're going to lose muscle if you enter a calorie deficit? If you look this up on the internet, you may come across two extreme camps. The people in one camp suggest that as soon as your workout performance drops by a couple of reps, gasp, you're losing muscle mass. In another camp, people claim that muscle loss is pretty much inevitable if you go into a deficit. Therefore, you shouldn't, even if you carry excess body fat, if your priority is to gain muscle, because not only is muscle gain impossible, but muscle loss is assured. These are two extreme positions that I personally do not agree with, based on the evidence that I am aware of and based on my experience working with clients since 2019. Now, it's true that research shows that you may lose some fat-free mass while you're in a deficit. And I use the key term fat-free mass because it's important to understand that what's measured in these studies isn't only muscle mass. Fat-free mass includes muscle mass, but also water, organ, bone, connective tissue mass, and the non-fatty components of adipose tissue, because adipose tissue or body fat isn't all completely made up of fat, just like muscle mass isn't all completely made up of muscle. Anyway, if a study shows a certain amount of fat-free mass loss, not all of that is necessarily muscle mass. Now, while this is true, it's also true that these studies don't always include within their protocols two elements that are crucial to muscle mass maintenance. One is resistance training, and the other is an adequate protein intake. When a weight loss intervention in a study does involve these two, the fat-free mass loss seems to always be attenuated compared to interventions that focus only on a calorie deficit. And that's not all. We also have research showing that it's possible to build muscle in a deficit. And I don't have only research to back this up, although obviously this is an important component of my assessment, but I've also experienced muscle gain myself in my fat loss phases, and with the majority of my clients who have been through a calorie deficit as well. So I'm not saying that the risk of muscle loss is non-existent, it's real, but there is more nuance to this topic than the two positions that I've described previously would have you believe. So moving on, I want to discuss who's more at risk for muscle loss. And this has to do with how much body fat you carry. Carrying more body fat, in quotation marks, protects you against muscle loss in a deficit, because body fat is a form of energy. So when you have it in excess amounts, your body is ready to give it up more readily than muscle mass. So when you have excess amounts of it, the body doesn't need to break down muscle mass for energy. It can simply dip into your fat stores, take some fat and convert it into energy. Therefore, the risk of muscle loss increases the leaner you are. Moreover, both maintaining and building muscle get harder the more well-trained you are, because a more well-trained physique requires a greater stimulus, which is generated by a resistance training program, in order to both maintain the growth that you've already achieved and to make additional gains. If you sum these two facts, what this means is that overweight people and people with obesity who are also new to resistance training are in the best position of us all, because they are the perfect candidates for what's called body recomposition, which is the process of building muscle and losing fat at the same time, even if they go into a deficit to lose their excess fat. Regardless of how much body fat you carry, there are strategies that we can implement to minimize the risk of muscle loss and to maximize the chances that we're actually going to get some muscle growth even during a calorie deficit. And if not muscle growth, at least muscle maintenance. And this will depend on how well trained you are. If you've been training for 20 years, realistically, with these strategies, you probably only maintain muscle mass in a deficit. But if you've only been training for a year, then chances are that you can also build some. Strategy number 1 is to avoid aggressive deficits for a prolonged period of time. And I mention a prolonged period of time because I believe that there is a place for an aggressive deficit. If you're not very lean, if you are overweight or if you have obesity, so you carry plenty of excess body fat, you're at the beginning of your diet, you're full of motivation and you've been eating at maintenance or maybe in a surplus up until very recently, then for a couple of weeks, getting into a very aggressive deficit to get substantial muscle loss very quickly is an option to consider. Other than your body fat level and the timeline of your diet, I would also invite you to consider how skilled of a dieter you are. In that, if you're very new to dieting, maybe an aggressive deficit isn't the best idea for you at this moment in time, even if you do carry plenty of body fat and you're at the beginning of the diet. On the other hand, if you've already been through other calorie deficits and you were able to stick to them somewhat successfully, then you have built the skills that you need to be consistent with a moderate deficit in the future, and therefore you may also have the necessary experience to be successful with more aggressive deficits. However, when you're contemplating a diet that's going to last several weeks or months, so beyond only a couple of weeks, I would highly recommend a moderate deficit. So you can either start with a moderate deficit and carry it on throughout, or you can start with a more aggressive deficit and then after a couple of weeks move into a more moderate deficit. Now, you've been listening to me up until this point, and you might be wondering, this is all well and good, Nick, but what do aggressive and moderate even mean? And here's the answer. Based on the evidence I'm aware of and my experience coaching clients, I typically help my clients achieve a rate of loss that helps them lose about 0.5 to 1.5% of their current body weight per week on average. The term on average is important because you may not lose 0.5 to 1.5% of your body weight every single week. But if you zoom out and you look at several weeks or several months in a row, that's the kind of trend that I'm helping my clients achieve. What I would consider a moderate deficit would be 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week. Whereas what I would consider a more aggressive deficit is anything above 1% of your body weight per week. For some people who have an excess amount of body fat to lose, so they are their BMI is equivalent to the higher end of the overweight spectrum or to the obese spectrum, then I would push this average as far as 2% of their body weight per week at the start of their fat loss diet when they have this great amount of body fat to lose, and then likely dial it down as they lose more and more body fat, depending on how well this person can handle the deficit required to achieve this rate of loss. And this is important because the faster you want to lose body fat, the greater the deficit you need to achieve, which means you need to eat fewer calories, do more physical activity, or a combination of the two. So when you consider how fast you want to lose fat, in addition to all the factors that I've mentioned so far, you also want to consider how realistic is it for you to achieve a certain deficit. Because if you can't realistically maintain the habits needed to be in a deficit that yields 1.25% of body weight loss per week, but you can maintain what's needed to achieve 0.75% of body weight loss per week, then the answer is already obvious. You don't want to go to 1.25. Maybe you do that for 2 weeks as part of your initial aggressive dieting protocol, but then for the remainder of the diet, you stick with 0.75% of body weight loss per week. Now, going back to what I said, whereby I would potentially push this percentage range up to 2% of body weight per week lost on average, I wouldn't recommend losing more than this unless you were supervised by a coach or by a medical professional and you were doing it for a relatively short period of time. There are certain dieting protocols that lead to losing 2% or more of your body weight per week, and they are often recommended by physicians. They're very short term, and in my view, they are only really helpful to kickstart a fat loss phase. And then afterwards, you would want to achieve a moderate deficit and maintain that until you get to the end of your diet. As a final note on the topic of choosing the size of your deficits, consider how strongly you would want to build muscle while in this fat loss phase. Because there's research showing that the rate of muscle gain slows down as the size of your deficit increases. And I'm going to talk about this in a lot more depth with Dr. Eric Trexler in next week's episode. So tune into that one, and I'm going to leave this here for now as a little bit of a sneak peek. Anyway, knowing about this research, you want to take into account that the faster you're trying to lose weight, the slower the rate of muscle gain, up to a point where muscle gain is going to stop altogether, and beyond a certain size of deficit, it can actually go in the opposite direction where now you are losing muscle mass. Therefore, if your main priority is fat loss and you don't care about building out of muscle, you're okay with maybe just maintaining, you can aim for a faster rate of loss. On the other hand, if maintaining and ideally growing more muscle is more important to you, even though you still want to prioritize fat loss because you're in a deficit, then you would want to stay closer to a rate of loss that's about equal to the lower end of the range I've discussed, so around 0.5% to 1% of your body weight per week. The second strategy is resistance train enough. Because, as I mentioned earlier, resistance training is one of your most effective tools against muscle loss in a deficit. Because, at a minimum, it signals to the body that your current amount of muscle needs to stay where it is. And at best, resistance training is going to stimulate more growth. But I did mention the keyword enough. So how much training is enough to at least maintain muscle? That's what I want to answer now. First of all, you need more volume, so more sets per body part per week, to continue growing muscle than to simply maintain it. So if growth is your goal, you want to do as many sessions as you need in order to perform the amount of volume that's required for you to stimulate additional hypertrophy. And I need to keep this vague, unfortunately, because volume needs are different depending on the person and on the muscle group. So the same person might need 10 sets to grow their hamstrings per week, but 25 to grow their back at the same rate per week. However, as a rule of thumb, we can fall back on research, and it seems that 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week is a reasonable guideline to stick to. So within this range, we are ensuring that muscle growth is occurring on average. Having said that, if you were training and making progress with a certain amount of volume before you decided to start a fat loss diet, I would continue following that same program, at least at the start of the deficit. Then you would modify the program as needed as you lose more and more fat. Now, covering how to tweak your program as your fat loss phase progresses isn't within the scope of this particular podcast, but I did record another one on what to do if you hit a training plateau, which answers these questions, among others, and that's episode 95. What to do if your training performance is stalling or getting worse. Assuming you don't want to build more muscle, but you only want to maintain what you already have, then you could do less volume because it's easier to hold on to previously built muscle than to add more. But at this moment in time, we don't have enough research for me to state with confidence how much less you can do and still maintain muscle. Let's move on to strategy number 3, which has to do with your mindset when you're training. You need to train with the intent of continuing to build muscle, because once you know that there's the potential for a slower rate of muscle growth and even the potential to only maintain muscle in a deficit, you can fall into the trap of telling yourself this: well, I'm in a deficit, that makes me hungry, it makes me more tired, so my performance is likely going to be down. But if you start telling yourself this, you know what happens? You can turn yourself into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I pulled up my client Corey on this a couple of years ago, or last year, can't remember now, because we've been working together forever, because he's the bomb. You go, Corey. Anyway, little shout out here because my clients are amazing. Anyway, Corey was going through his second fat loss phase, and he was telling me exactly this in some check-ins. I'm a little bit tired, I'm a little bit hungry, and my performance wasn't the best, but that's understandable because I'm in a deficit. And I told him straight up, don't start thinking this, because you turn yourself into a self-fulfilling prophecy this way. And lo and behold, after I made that point, in the following check-in, he immediately said to me, you know what, you were right. I went into my training sessions this past week and I set some new PBs, so clearly I was holding myself back. What you want to do is to step into the gym with the specific intent of continuing to beat your past performance over time. Whether that happens or not is out of your hands. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It depends on many factors, which I won't go into today. But you want to think that you will be able to beat yourself, because if you don't believe it, there's a greater chance that it won't happen. Now, strategy number 4, eat enough protein. And this is also something I've already covered in this podcast so far. Alongside training, a high protein diet has been proven to be beneficial to prevent or reduce muscle loss in a deficit. If you're not training, a high protein diet alone may not be enough, because training is the stimulus for muscle growth and maintenance. But when you're training, you couple the training with an appropriate protein intake, and you are giving yourself the best chance to not only maintain but also build muscle. And in order to maximize growth, I would recommend to eat 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of normal BMI body weight per day. And I mentioned normal BMI body weight, so a body weight that falls within the normal BMI category relative to your height, because if you carry excess body fat and you're overweight or you have obesity, and you calculate your protein requirements based on your current body weight, you're going to get a humongous amount of protein as your target, which is unnecessary because technically, the best way to calculate your protein target is to base it off your lean mass, so only your muscle mass, not your fat mass. However, I don't like to use this method because there is no reliable method that's easily accessible to any of us to measure your body fat percentage and your lean mass percentage. I would rather base the calculation off of your entire body mass, so your body weight, even if it does include the weight of your bones, the weight of your body fat, and so on. So as a result, the protein requirement is already less precise, which is why I think it's valuable to use your normal BMI body weight as opposed to your current weight when you carry excess body fat, because the excess body fat would make the protein requirements all the more imprecise. So to give you an example, let's say you're 5'7" or 1.7 meters tall or 170 centimeters tall. A BMI of 24, which is at the top end of the normal BMI range, which goes from 18.5 to 24.9, a BMI of 24 at this height would be 69 kilograms. So based on this body weight, your ideal protein range is going to be 110 to 152 grams per day. But let's say that you are overweight and you are 100 kilograms right now. Well, that would make your range 160, which is already above the top of the range for a 69 kilogram person. So it would be 160 to 220, which is, well, at the top end, it's twice as much as the bottom end of 110. And obviously, the greater the protein target is, the harder it is to achieve. So why make it harder on yourself when it's not necessary? Having said that, I don't think that 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of normal BMI body weight per day needs to be an upper limit for protein consumption. In fact, there is some evidence showing that higher protein intakes may improve your chances of building muscle at the same time as losing body fat. For instance, there was a study titled Effects of High versus Low Protein Intake on Body Composition and Maximal Strength in Aspiring Female Physique Athletes engaging in an 8-week resistance training program by Dr. Campbell, whom I interviewed on this very podcast, and colleagues who published this in 2020. And in this study, the participants were divided into two groups. One group was eating 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram per day. In the other group, the participants were eating 0.9 grams of protein per kilogram per day. Now, the group eating 2.5 grams of protein lost about 1 kilogram of fat mass over 8 weeks and gained about 2 kilograms of fat-free mass over the same time period. Now again, fat-free mass, so it's not all muscle, but some of this is. On the other hand, the participants eating 0.9 grams of protein per kilogram per day didn't lose any fat mass, and they increased their fat-free mass by 0.6 of a kilogram, instead of 2 kilograms like in the other group. Both groups were following the same resistance training program. The only difference was how much protein they were eating. So these are pretty impressive results in favor of a higher protein intake that goes even above and beyond 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day. So if you like protein, for example, I really love protein and I find myself eating about 2.7 to 3.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, regardless of caloric intake, whether I'm in a deficit or not. I'm always hovering around 140 to 160 grams when I'm hovering around 50 kilograms of body weight. And if you don't have any pre-existing condition whereby your doctor has expressly told you don't go above this protein intake, and I mention pre-existing because we have plenty of evidence showing that protein on its own will not cause any health issues, even consumed in great amounts over a long period of time, then I would recommend that you eat essentially as much protein as you can, as long as you're getting an adequate amount of the other nutrients that you need within your calorie budget. The only time when I wouldn't recommend increasing protein is when doing so would come at the expense of some essential nutrients. Moving on to strategy number 5, we're staying with food here. The next strategy is prioritize your peri-workout meals. And by peri-workout, I mean the meals before, after, and if you have any, during your workouts. At maintenance calories, or when you're in a surplus, your caloric intake across the day is sufficient to fuel training. So while I wouldn't recommend training fasted unless it were absolutely necessary, I also don't think it would be the end of the world if you were at least at maintenance calories. But in my view, prioritizing these peri-workout meals becomes far more important in a deficit, and especially the longer you've been dieting for and the leaner you are getting. Since you have fewer calories available, on average across the day, scheduling a large amount of these calories, or the majority of these calories, around your sessions can help you more easily preserve and continue to improve your performance, hopefully, and also to ensure adequate recovery for future sessions. So you're giving yourself the best chance that you can, not only to maintain muscle, but also to build more of it. Saying that, I did just mention that the degree of importance depends once again on your current body fat levels, as well as how long you've been dieting for. If you're at the beginning of a dieting phase and you have a lot of extra fat to lose, you wouldn't have to worry about prioritizing peri-workout meals as much as somebody who's been dieting for 12 weeks already. They're going to be dieting for 20 weeks and they're trying to get really lean, and they didn't have excess body fat to begin with because they're trying to get ready for a photo shoot for which they want to be particularly lean. In terms of general guidelines, if you're in a deficit, I would suggest sandwiching your training session between 2 main meals or a main meal and a snack. But for some people, this is unrealistic because, for example, you need to train at 4 a.m. in the morning because you have a shift immediately afterwards. In this case, you may not want to scarf down an entire meal and then risk throwing up during your session, which I completely understand and I would not recommend. 0 out of 10 recommend throwing up while training. However, what I would consider in that case is to drink a protein shake before you go to the gym, and or, depending on the situation, you might be able to do both or you might have to do one or the other. You could take a carbohydrate containing beverage to the gym to drink while you're working out. And the reason why I would want it to contain carbohydrates is that carbs are the primary fuel for a resistance training session. And I would specifically choose a beverage containing a form of fast digesting carbohydrates, essentially sugar, like maltodextrin, because you need those carbohydrates to be absorbed and digested as quickly as possible, to be made available in your bloodstream to be used up for the training session. To make that happen, in addition to choosing a form of fast digesting carbs, I suggest starting to drink your intra-workout beverage some 15 to 20 minutes before you start your workout, and to finish it at the latest, probably by the time you reach the halfway point in your workout if you train for about an hour. Obviously, this is only a rule of thumb because it also depends on how many carbs the drink actually contains and your individual speed of digestion. However, it's a reasonable starting point so that your body has the time to convert those carbohydrates into glucose in the bloodstream, and the glucose can then be shuttled to your muscles to fuel your resistance training session. If you started drinking your intra workout halfway through the workout, you would have done half of it without this glucose available. So you would have been using up your glycogen stores, which are already a little bit depleted because you have been in a deficit. And then potentially you might not even have digested any of these carbohydrate drink or a very small amount of it before the end of the workout. So you wouldn't be utilizing these carbs very much during this session, if at all. Last but not least, I wouldn't go longer than 4 or 5 hours without eating or drinking anything on either side of your training sessions. Because in addition to the negative impact that this can have on your training performance and recovery, it can make you feel really hungry, which can definitely compromise your ability not to stuff your face and stick to your deficits. As an example, if you eat breakfast at 7 a.m. and then you wait an hour to digest and then you train from 8 to 9 a.m., I'd suggest having at least a small snack by 11 a.m. at the latest if you're not going to eat until 1 p.m. The sixth and final strategy I want to talk about is sleep. You want to sleep as well as you can, because research shows that if you're sleep deprived and you are in a deficit, you can lose a greater percentage of weight as fat-free mass than if you were to lose the same amount of weight when you were not sleep deprived. In both cases, we're talking about losing 10 kilograms as a random number. But if you're sleep deprived, a greater percentage of these 10 kilograms will come from fat-free mass. Whereas if you are not sleep deprived, a smaller percentage will come from fat-free mass. And I know which option I prefer. So sleep is always important, but it's especially important in a calorie deficit. Therefore, if any of your dietary strategies to be in a deficit or to accomplish a deficit lead to sleep deprivation, I would strongly encourage you to change this. For instance, I was recently checking in with a client and they were telling me that they were doing their best to stick to their step targets, even though they were going through a really busy season of life at work. But they ended up doing a lot of their steps late in the evening, and it was making them go to bed later than usual, and it was having a knock-on effect on their sleep quality. As soon as I heard this, I told them straight up, sacrifice the steps, do not sacrifice the sleep. And I recommend the same to you as well. And if you want to hear more about evidence-based sleep recommendations for health, muscle growth, and fat loss, you want to check out episode 92, which I recorded with Greg Potter, who has a PhD in the area of sleep. And I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes for you. So these are the 6 strategies that I strongly encourage you to follow in order to maintain as much muscle as possible in a deficit, and ideally to build some as well. And I want to wrap up this podcast by talking about how you can tell whether you're losing muscle in a deficit. And the answer to this question is admittedly really challenging because, to my knowledge, we do not have easily accessible or particularly accurate ways to measure muscle mass at any point in time. So, as far as I'm concerned, the best proxy is your training performance. If your training performance is staying the same or it's going up over time, then you're maintaining muscle at least, or at best, you're gaining more muscle. But it's also important not to think of your performance in absolute terms, but in relation to your body weight. So you'd be considering relative performance as opposed to absolute performance. And I'll give you an example to clarify what I mean. Let's say that you start your diet at 100 kilograms of body weight and you can deadlift 100 kilograms for 10 reps. So you can deadlift your own body weight for 10 repetitions. So you can deadlift your body weight times 1. You diet for 12 weeks, you lose 10 kilograms, you weigh 90 kilograms. Your performance has not changed. You can still deadlift 100 kilograms for 10 reps, but you are lighter. So relative to your body weight, you can now deadlift your body weight times 1.1, not just 1.0. So while it looks like your performance hasn't changed, it's actually increased. Your relative strength has increased because you're now smaller, but your performance is staying the same. And this is a potential sign that you've not just maintained, but you've actually increased your muscle mass throughout your 12 weeks of dieting. And that's all for today's episode. In summary, if you want to avoid muscle loss during a fat loss phase, not only is this possible, but you can also gain more muscle by focusing on the following strategies. Stay in a moderate deficit for the majority of the time. Resistance train enough. Train with the intent of continuing to improve your performance over time. Eat a high protein diet. Prioritize your peri-workout meals and sleep as well as you can. As always, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you want to connect with me or to send me an application to join my online coaching client team, you can do so via the links in the description below. I look forward to continuing to record this podcast for you, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.